railroad depot in San Luis Obispo, showing Chinese workers laying track. And one tragedy involved Louis, who was a labor contractor who provided a lot of the labor for the building of the Pacific Coast Railway. This is Chinatown in the 1890s. The Louis store on the corner, which is still there, had been built in 1874. The store was on the bottom floor, and Louis and his family lived on the top floor. There were 8 little Louis. The youngest one, Howard, said he was 21 before he discovered there was any other part to the chicken than the neck, because as the chicken went around the table, he was the youngest and he got the last piece, and it was always the neck. Howard was asleep in his mother's arms. This is Ngan Ying, which translates as silver dove. She was from San Francisco. Louis had been married once before in China. It's uncertain what happened to that marriage, but that wife was far, far away. So Louis went up to San Francisco, where he had contracted to marry this woman, and she's the woman who would bear him the 8 children who lived in the floor above the store. It said that she only left that building twice the rest of her life. I don't know what one occasion was, but the other was a trip to the dentist. And her children were musicians, Army officers. One daughter was the California State Spelling Bee champion. So judging from her children, she must have been a wonderful mother. Now, one day, Louis took the Pacific Coast train down to Arroyo Grande for a meeting with his business partner there, Louis Routson, who was a flower grower. His wife saw him off, then went back to bed with little Howard asleep in her arms. Someone entered the sleeping quarters and shot her dead at point blank range with a Colt revolver. And here is an elderly Louis. That's Howard on the left, who would live into the early 2000s. Yancey McFadden was a sheriff at the time, and he had a hunch. He took the train up to San Francisco. This is a wonderful Arnold Ginty picture of Chinatown before the earthquake. And he found his man. And his man, as it turns out, was a son from Louis's first marriage. Willie Lewis was the prime suspect in the murder. And McFadden's hunch was right. He brought Willie back to San Luis Obispo on the train, where they found some of Ngan Ying's jewelry buried in Willie Lewis's garden. They found some cash in his chest of drawers. And when they pumped out the cesspool behind the store, they found a .38 Colt revolver, the murder weapon. So it did not take long for the jury to convict Willie Lewis of the murder of his stepmother. What took a little bit longer was deciding on the penalty. Evidently, the death penalty was enormously controversial in California in the early 1900s. Evidently, too, the motive for Willie's murder of Ngan Ying, there had been tremendous friction between him and his stepmother. She did not appreciate being a very proper woman. Willie lived in a lean-to behind the store with a live-in prostitute. She didn't appreciate that one darn bit, not the mother trying to raise 8 children. Also, he was worried that he would be cut out of the will. So what better shortcut to take than to murder his stepmother and make away with some of her possessions? Well, unfortunately for Willie, when the jury began deliberation on the penalty phase, they began deliberating on a Wednesday. Thursday was Thanksgiving. So they struggled for a while, and then they all decided they wanted to go home and have turkey the next day. So the result was, those are Willie's booking photos at San Quentin, that he was hanged at San Quentin in 1912. And the idea of Chinese immigration, I think, has a distinct connection to one of the most notorious events in Rio Grande's history, and that's a double lynching in 1886. You can see that rudimentary, that's a bridge over the Rio Grande Creek near the base of Crown Hill. That's the Pacific Coast Railway trestle. Now, for a little background, there was immense anti-Chinese prejudice in California in 1886. This is an advertisement for a washing machine. The logic was many Chinese supported themselves by operating laundries. So the idea is if you buy this magic washing machine, we'll be able to kick the Chinese out of America. And there you see Uncle Sam doing just that. San Luis Obispo laid a heavy tax on Chinese laundries. Somebody tried to blow up one of them, owned by a man named Sam Yee. It was dynamited. And at the same time, throughout California, there was a group of men led by an Irish immigrant named Dennis Corney, who they were called sandlotters, whose motto was "The Chinese must go." So they were the impetus for a lot of anti-Chinese prejudice in California. And then when the economy began to turn a little bit in the mid 1880s, that's when it really got intense. As I mentioned, Sam Yee's laundry in San Luis Obispo, someone tried to blow it up. And then down here in Rio Grande, in February, and here's a clipping from a newspaper article, a crowd of masked men, referred to here as the Rio Grande Anti-Chinese Club, descended on whatever Chinatown was back in those days, and essentially gave the residents the ultimatum: they would have to leave town or they would be killed. Now, at the same time, seemingly unconnected to anti-Chinese prejudice, there was a double murder in Lopez Canyon. It was a result of a long-standing property dispute between a young couple, Eugene and Nancy Walker, and a family called the Hemis, Peter Hemi and his son PJ. Hemi was evidently obsessed with the idea that the Walker family's property actually belonged to him. So he and PJ began poisoning their livestock, began breaking down fences. Young Mr. Walker sought a restraining order against the Hemis shortly before PJ showed up one day on their place with a rifle. He promptly shot Eugene Walker dead. Walker was in his vegetable garden. Then he shot the family dog. And then when young Mrs. Walker came out of the house, he shot her twice. And then he never said a word. He simply walked away. Nancy Walker, her arm was shattered and another bullet went through her lung. She dragged herself with her 3-year-old daughter a mile and a half to the Myrtle farm nearby and reported the murders to the Myrtle family, who in turn informed the authorities. So a town constable, Constable Whiteley, and a sheriff's deputy brought the Hemis back to Arroyo Grande. They were lodged in what passed for a jail near the creek, that lower circle you see there. And again, by jail, I probably I think of something not much more substantial than those big cardboard boxes that your refrigerator comes in. But that night, the night of the arrest, March 31st, 1886, Eubanks and Whiteley were having supper in a restaurant along Branch Street when a crowd of men wearing masks, just as they had been when they descended on Chinatown, burst into the restaurant, locked Whiteley and Eubanks into a utility room, and then marched down to the jail. One of the participants in the lynch mob was 15 years old. He was Fred Jones, who was Francis Branch's grandson. He spoke to my big brother's classes at Branch School, the older kids, when he was well into his 80s. And he said, when we entered the jail, the one person we did not expect to be there was Mrs. Hemme. She knew exactly what was about to happen. And he said, I will never forget the look on her face. The mob took the Hemmes up what is today Olahan Alley and tied ropes around their necks, and they were simply shoved off the railroad trestle. And this is about, there's an antique shop. That's roughly the spot where this would have happened. Sadly, the next day, April Fool's Day, the bodies were still hanging from that railroad trestle, which you see here. And the people who discovered them were little kids on their way to the grammar school, which you can see in the other oval, which stood on the side of today's Malahi Ford. So that's another immensely tragic part of this story. And it was pardon me, it was sensational. This is an article from the San Francisco Examiner. I read accounts of this lynching in newspapers in Scotland. So it was something that definitely made headlines. Pardon me for just a second. And PJ had gone to the Santa Manuela school, which unfortunately burned. But people being thrifty in those days salvaged timbers from the old school and built this one, which of course stands in Heritage Square today. So PJ School, at least timbers from it, stands only about 200 yards from the place where his life ended in 1886. The town got rather self-righteous about the lynchings. A detective arrived to try to figure out what exactly had happened. Nobody was saying anything. And even the Methodist pastor praised the actions of the lynch mob from the pulpit. And of course, the authorities and the religious figures in town refused to allow the Hemmes to be buried in consecrated ground. It was Mrs. Branch, who evidently knew Mrs. Hemme, who invited her to bury Peter and PJ in all places, the Branch family cemetery. So two of the most notorious figures in Arroyo Grande history are buried in the same graveyard as the family that founded Arroyo Grande. Now here again, 5 days after the lynching, a suspiciously familiar crowd of masked men descended on the Pacific Coast Railway being extended to Nipomo. The workers were Chinese. They got a similar warning to the one that had been given the Chinese in Arroyo Grande. Leave now or you will be killed. And this is an article that they've spelled Nipomo, Nisoma, go figure. But the Chinese took the hint and fled to safety via handcar back to San Luis Obispo. So my hunch is that thanks to anti-Chinese prejudice, there was a kind of ready-made mob mentality in Arroyo Grande. I'm sure they considered themselves kind of the descendants of the Minutemen at Lexington and Concord. And it was unfortunate, for one, the Hemmes probably did commit the murders, at least PJ did. And unfortunate